The trench was the strangest thing anyone in the Loup River Valley had ever seen. In the late summer of 1879, while other men were chinking logs and banking their soddies high with earth against the coming winter, Tomas Wierzykowski was digging. Not a root cellar, not a well, but a deep, 4-foot gash in the earth that circled his entire cabin. It looked like a moat, a defensive earthwork against an enemy no one could see. Wagons slowed on the lane that passed his claim. Men leaned on their scythes in the fields, watching the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his shovel. The valley floor, a wide, fertile basin carved by the river, was a magnet for the cold. Everyone knew it. When the sun dropped behind the western bluffs, the chill didn't just descend, it flowed. It poured down the draws and coulees, settling in the low spots, a heavy, invisible tide. Tomas's cabin sat right in its path. Whit Carowway, the township road overseer, stopped his buggy one afternoon. He was a practical man, his authority vested in the straightness of his ditches and the soundness of his culverts. He watched Tomas levering a stone out of the trench wall. "Wierzykowski," Carowway said, his voice carrying the easy weight of his office. "That's a peculiar sort of fence you're building?" Tomas paused, resting one hand on the handle of his shovel. He looked at the trench, then at the road overseer. "Is not a fence. Whatever it is, it's too close to the lane," Carowway continued, pointing with his whip. "Come the spring thaw or a heavy rain, that edge is going to slump. The whole bank will slide. And my road with it. The township will be out here for a week rebuilding it, on the taxpayer's dime." Tomas wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He said nothing for a moment, his gaze fixed on the precise, sloping angle of the trench floor. "It will not slump," he finally said, his English thick but clear. Carowway scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Every ditch in Nebraska slumps without a proper retaining wall. What makes you think yours is any different?" The question hung in the dry autumn air. The Polish settler didn't offer an explanation. He simply picked up his shovel and went back to work, leaving the road overseer staring at the curious, seemingly pointless hole in the ground. The valley watched and wondered. They saw a man digging a trench to protect himself from the winter, and it made no sense at all. They thought he was trying to build a wall against the cold. They were wrong. He was building a riverbed. This story is about a different kind of thinking. It's not about fighting a force of nature, but understanding its path. If you value that kind of practical wisdom, the quiet genius that often goes unnoticed, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. I promise you stories like this one, rooted in real history and the timeless physics of survival. Take a moment to like this video and tell us in the comments. What's the most counterintuitive piece of advice you've ever received that actually worked? Tomas Wierzykowski was not a farmer. He had a claim, he had a team of oxen, and he planted what he needed to survive. But the soil was not his first language. He was not a carpenter, though he had built his own cabin from cottonwood logs, the axe feeling clumsy and oversized in his hands. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the way the American-born settlers were, men who could read the land for sign and weather, with an instinct he lacked. Tomas was a digger. His identity was not in what he built up, but in what he cut down into the earth. He came from Galicia, a region of rolling hills and harsh winters in southern Poland, then under the heel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There he hadn't worked with wood, but with stone and soil. He was a man who understood foundations. For 15 years, he had been part of a crew that dug frost trenches around the deep stone cellars of prosperous farms and small estates. His hands knew the heft and balance of a mattock, the sharp bite of a spade in dense clay, the grating sound of a shovel on gravel. He had spent his life cutting precise, sloped channels into the ground for one reason: to keep the root vaults dry, and more importantly, to keep the frost from heaving the massive stone walls. In Galicia, the enemy was water, and the frost that followed it. The old masters had taught him the unwritten laws of the earth. They taught him how to read the soil by its color and texture, how to sight a grade with nothing but a length of twine and a weighted string, how to lay a bed of gravel so that it would move water with an invisible, inexorable pull. He learned that a trench was not just a hole, it was an argument made with the land. It was a carefully constructed channel designed to persuade a natural force to go somewhere else. He had dug hundreds of them, each one a testament to the principle that you don't stop a flood by damming it. You stop it by giving it an easier path to follow. When he arrived in the Loup River Valley with his wife, Aniela, and their young son, Kazimierz, he brought that knowledge with him, packed away like a set of well-worn tools. They had come for the promise of land, a piece of the world that would be entirely their own. But their first winter, the winter of 1878, had nearly broken them. It had introduced them to a new kind of enemy. It wasn't the dramatic violence of a blizzard that tested them, but the quiet, relentless pressure of still, heavy cold. Their cabin, built like every other on the valley floor, became a cage of ice. In the mornings, Aniela would wake to find a fine white rime of frost coating the floor planks around the edges of the room. The nail heads in the floorboards seemed to bleed cold, tiny black circles of frigid iron that could be felt even through the thickest wool socks. When she lit the lamp, the wick would smoke and sputter, the flame struggling for air in the dense, oxygen-starved atmosphere that pooled at floor level. Little Kazimierz, barely 4 years old, was perpetually sick. His small body racked with a cough that echoed in the cold, silent cabin. They burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate, the stove glowing red-hot. Yet the cold remained, a physical presence that pressed in from below, turning the floor into a sheet of ice. Tomas, the man who understood foundations, felt a profound and terrifying shame. He had built a home for his family that was failing to keep them safe. The cold wasn't just getting in through the walls, it was seeping up from the very ground they stood on. The problem tormenting the settlers of the Loup River Valley was not a failure of insulation. It was a failure of imagination. They understood the cold as an invasive force, something that attacked from all sides, and their defenses were built accordingly. They stuffed grass and mud into the gaps between their logs, a process they called chinking. They banked earth and sawed high against the foundation walls, hoping to use the ground itself as a blanket. They hung heavy quilts over their doors and windows. They fed their stoves endlessly, turning cords of precious cottonwood into a furious but ultimately futile blaze. Their efforts were a direct assault on the cold, an attempt to build an impenetrable fortress. But every morning, they woke up defeated. The water buckets were frozen solid. A layer of ice, thick as a window pane, coated the inside of the windows. The floors were dangerously slick with frost. The very air at their feet felt heavy and dead. They were fighting the wrong war. The true enemy was gravity. On clear, windless nights, a phenomenon known as radiation cooling took place. The Earth's surface, no longer warmed by the sun, radiated its heat out into the blackness of space. The air in direct contact with the ground grew intensely cold, far colder than the air just a few feet above it. As this air cooled, it also became denser and heavier. And like any fluid, this heavy cold air began to flow. It slid off the surrounding hills and bluffs, draining down into the valley in a slow, silent, invisible flood. It filled the low-lying areas, pooling in the basin just as water would. The cabins on the valley floor were submerged in a lake of super-chilled air that could be 10, 20, even 30 feet deep. The settlers were living at the bottom of a river of cold. This frigid air, dense and heavy, exerted a steady pressure. It pushed against the base of their cabins, finding every tiny crack in the foundation. every gap between the floorboards and the sill logs. The banked earth they piled against their homes did little good. The cold simply soaked through it, chilling the ground and the foundation logs until they became conduits of frost. The problem wasn't that the heat was escaping. The problem was that the cold was pressing its way in from below, a constant hydrostatic pressure that could not be stopped by chinking or blankets. Tomas saw his neighbors, good men like the Sullivans 2 claims over, working themselves to exhaustion. John Sullivan had spent a week hauling manure from his lean-to and piling it against his foundation, hoping the heat of its decomposition would fight back the frost. It created a foul-smelling mess, and by January, the pile had frozen into a solid, useless block of ice. The cold came through anyway. The Sullivans' youngest daughter was sick all winter, her breathing shallow and ragged in the frigid air of their cabin. They were doing more of what didn't work, believing that sheer effort could defeat a principle of physics. Tomas watched them, his heart aching for their struggle, because he knew they were trying to dam a river with handfuls of mud. In late August of 1879, with the memory of the previous winter still sharp in his mind, Tomas began to dig. He didn't start by felling more trees or hauling more sod. He started by walking the perimeter of his cabin with a handful of wooden stakes and a length of twine. He marked out a line 3 feet from his foundation walls, forming a perfect rectangle around his home. Then he broke the earth with the tip of his shovel. The work was brutally hard. The prairie soil was a dense mat of grass roots, thick and tough as leather. Below that lay a heavy clay, studded with stones, that had to be patiently worked loose and pried out. He worked from sunup to sundown, his movements economical and practiced. Aniela would bring him water and a midday meal of bread and cheese, her face a mixture of hope and worry. Kazimierz would watch his father, a small, silent observer, as the trench grew deeper and longer each day. It was not just a ditch, it was a precisely engineered channel. Tomas dug the floor of the trench with a consistent, gentle slope. It was almost imperceptible to the naked eye, a fall of just 1 inch for every 10 feet of length. He began at the highest point of the ground on the north side of his cabin and worked his way around, the trench bottom dropping steadily until it reached the lowest point on the south side, where it emptied into a natural swale that ran away from his property. The signature moment of the construction came when he was checking the grade. He drove a stake at the high end of a completed section and another 50 feet down the line. He tied a string taut between them, then hung his plumb bob, a simple lead weight on a thread, from the center of the string. He pulled the string level, using a small water level he had made from a hollowed-out piece of wood. Then he measured the distance from the level string down to the trench floor at multiple points. He was not guessing, he was measuring. He was imposing an old-world logic onto the wild Nebraska prairie. Whit Carowway saw him doing this and stopped again, this time getting out of his buggy. He watched the meticulous, slow process with a frown of pure incomprehension. "What in God's name are you doing with all that string, Wierzycowski?" Tomas pointed. "For the slope. Must be perfect." "The slope of what? It's a hole in the ground," Carowway said, his frustration growing. "I told you, this is a menace to my road. You're creating a weak spot, an invitation for a washout." "The water will not wash it out," Tomas replied calmly, not looking up from his measurement. "Of course it will. It's a ditch. That's what ditches do. They carry water, and water erodes." "This ditch," Tomas said, finally meeting the overseer's gaze, "is not for water." That statement, more than anything, convinced Carowway that the Pole was mad. A ditch not for water? What else could it be for? He shook his head and walked back to his buggy, making a mental note to bring the matter up at the next township meeting. This foolishness had to be stopped before it caused real damage. By late September, the trench was complete. It was 4 feet deep and 2 feet wide, a clean, sharp cut ringing the cabin. The final step was to fill it. Tomas spent another 2 weeks hauling gravel from a creek bed a mile away, load by painstaking load in his small wagon. He filled the entire trench to the top with the loose, round stones. The final result was a 3-foot-wide perimeter of gravel around his home, level with the surrounding ground. To a casual observer, it looked like a decorative path, but beneath the surface lay a 4-foot-deep, perfectly sloped, permeable channel. He had not built a wall, he had built a drain for the cold. To understand what Tomas Wierzycowski had built, you must first stop thinking of cold as a quality and start thinking of it as a substance. Imagine it as a clear, heavy liquid, like invisible water. On a still, frigid night, this liquid is continuously being produced as the ground radiates its heat into space. The air in contact with the earth becomes this liquid, and it begins to flow downhill, following the contours of the land. This is the principle of cold air drainage. It is a fundamental law of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, as reliable as the law of gravity that drives it. The coldest, densest air will always seek the lowest point. In the Loup River Valley, that lowest point was the flat basin floor, where the settlers had built their homes. A standard cabin foundation, even one banked with earth, acts like a dam against this flow. The invisible river of cold air piles up against the foundation walls. It has nowhere else to go, so it presses against the logs and stones, its temperature slowly seeping through the material by conduction. It chills the very ground beneath the cabin, which in turn chills the floorboards from below. The air inside the cabin, near the floor, becomes cold and dense itself, stratifying the room into layers. The heat from the stove rises to the ceiling, leaving a pool of frigid, stagnant air at the occupant's feet. This is why the lamp wicks smoked. The flame was being starved of oxygen in the heavy carbon dioxide-rich layer of cold air. This is why their feet were always freezing, no matter how hot the stove. They were wading in a pool of cold. Tomas's trench was an elegant, simple solution to this complex problem. It functioned as an interceptor drain, a common tool in managing groundwater, but applied to a different fluid, cold air. As the river of cold air flowed down the slight grade of the valley toward his cabin, it encountered the gravel-filled trench first. Because the air was heavier and denser than the warmer air around it, it sank. It fell down through the gaps between the pieces of gravel, dropping 4 feet to the bottom of the trench. Once at the bottom, it was trapped. The trench was now a channel, and the cold air, still behaving like a liquid, began to flow along the path of least resistance. It followed the gentle 1% grade that Tomas had so painstakingly engineered. It flowed around the cabin, contained within the trench, and then exited at the low point on the south side, continuing on its journey down the valley into the swale. The trench effectively captured the cold air before it could ever reach the cabin's foundation. It created a cold shadow, protecting the ground underneath and immediately surrounding the cabin from the encroaching flood. By diverting the flow, Tomas wasn't trying to warm the air. He was simply giving the cold, heavy air somewhere else to go. He had dug a culvert for the atmosphere. The BTUs, the units of heat energy being produced by his small stove, didn't have to fight a constant pressurized invasion of cold from below. They only had to contend with the normal, manageable heat loss through the walls and roof. He hadn't built a better fortress, he had diverted the siege. That November, the sky cleared. For 13 consecutive nights, not a cloud appeared in the vast dark expanse above Nebraska. The wind fell silent, the air grew perfectly still. This was not a blizzard, with its dramatic fury of snow and wind. This was a radiation freeze, a quiet, insidious killer. Each day the sun offered a brief, deceptive warmth, but as soon as it set, the temperature began to plummet. The ground, unprotected by a blanket of clouds, radiated all its stored warmth into the void. By the fourth night, the valley floor was reaching 20 degrees below zero. By the seventh, it was 30 below. On the 10th, 11th, and 12th nights, the spirit thermometer outside the general store in the small settlement of Dannebrog bottomed out at minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit. A profound and dangerous silence fell over the valley. The usual sounds of the frontier, the lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs, the distant ring of an axe, all ceased. Everything was frozen. Men spent their entire days and nights feeding their stoves, but the cabins grew colder. The Sullivans' windows were opaque with frost an inch thick. John had to take an axe to the waterhole every 2 hours, chopping through 6 inches of new ice each time. Inside their home, they lived in a small circle of misery around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. When they spoke, their breath plumed in the air. Their door was frozen fast in its jamb, the wood swollen and locked in place by the ice. To get out, John had to throw his shoulder against it with all his might, the crack of the ice seal as loud as a pistol shot in the still air. At the Wierzykowski cabin, life went on. In the morning, when the world outside was a landscape of brittle, crystalline ice, Aniela rose from her bed, walked across the room in her stocking feet, and opened the door to the pantry. The floorboards were cool, but not cold. There was no rime of frost along the walls. Little Kazimierz slept soundly in his cot, not with the shallow, rattling breath of a sick child, but with the deep, easy rhythm of a healthy one. The proof of the trench's power was in the smallest, most mundane details. It was in the way Aniela could draw a bucket of water from the barrel inside and find no skim of ice on its surface. It was in the way the candle on the table burned with a steady, upright flame, not a flickering, smoky one. And most of all, it was in the front door. Every morning Tomas would rise just before dawn. He would walk to the door, lift the simple wooden latch, and pull. The heavy plank door swung inward smoothly, silently, on its leather hinges. There was no resistance, no groan of protest from swollen wood, no sharp crack of a frost seal breaking. The door moved as freely as it did in July. Outside, the air was so cold, it stung the lungs. A painful, crystalline cold. But the threshold, the sill, the door jamb, the very bones of the cabin's foundation were untouched by the deep freeze. While every other family in the valley was trapped behind a wall of ice until the mid-morning sun could free them, Tomas Wierzykowski's door swung open to the dawn. He was not just surviving the cold, he was living in defiance of it. Whit Carowway was a man defined by duty. As road overseer, a brutal, cold snap like this was a direct challenge to his domain. His primary concern was frost heaves, the destructive power of frozen water in the soil to buckle and ruin a roadbed. At dawn on the 13th day of the freeze, he was out walking his section of the township lane, inspecting the culverts and the low spots, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The air was utterly still and painfully cold. As he walked, he could feel the cold pooling around his ankles, a palpable sensation of weight and density. The valley was a bowl filled with it. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his face, his exhaled breath instantly freezing on the wool. He was checking the wooden culvert near the Wierzykowski claim, worried it might have been crushed by the frozen earth, when he noticed something strange. He was standing in the middle of the lane, about 30 feet from Tomas's cabin. His certainty, the one he had held all autumn, was that the Pole's foolish trench would have collapsed by now, taking the edge of the road with it. He expected to see a slumped, broken mess. Instead, the road was perfectly intact. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what he felt against his legs. From his knees down, he was immersed in a current of intensely cold air, flowing gently but steadily down the lane. It was a distinct moving river of cold, sliding along the surface of the ground. But as this current neared Tomas's property line, it did something that defied all of Carowway's experience. It turned. The river of air veered sharply to the right and disappeared. He took a few steps forward, puzzled. He could feel the edge of the current as clearly as if it were water. On one side, the slow-moving, bitter cold. On the other, just still air, cold, but without the same biting weight. He followed the flow. It led directly to the gravel perimeter around the cabin. He watched, mystified, as the river of cold air reached the gravel and simply vanished, as if pouring down a drain. He knelt, cautiously placing a bare hand over the stones. An icy draft was breathing downward, into the earth. Then he looked up at the cabin. The sight broke his certainty completely. Every other cabin foundation in the valley, his own included, was plastered with a thick, white, feathery layer of hoarfrost. Every stone, every log sill at ground level was encased in it. It was the signature of the deep freeze, the physical evidence of where the cold was pressing hardest. But the foundation logs of Tomas Wierzycowski's cabin were bare. They were dark, clean, and dry, looking exactly as they had in October. There was a visible line, a stark demarcation. The frost coated the ground right up to the edge of the gravel trench, and there it stopped. Absolutely. The cold was flowing around the house, not against it. In that moment, standing in the dawn of the coldest morning of his life, Whit Carowway understood. The trench wasn't a structural threat to his road. It was a piece of engineering more sophisticated than any culvert he had ever built. It wasn't a ditch for water. It was a drain for the winter itself. He stood up, no longer feeling the cold, his mind consumed by the elegant, undeniable truth of what he was seeing. He looked at the silent, sleeping cabin, and then at the dark, dry foundation, and felt a profound sense of respect. The quiet Polish immigrant hadn't been a fool. He had been a physicist. The next day, as the freeze finally began to break, Whit Carowway knocked on Tomas Wierzycowski's door. When Tomas opened it, Carowway didn't offer a greeting. He just pointed at the trench. "Show me," he said. Tomas invited him in. For an hour, with Aniela translating the more difficult words and Tomas drawing diagrams in the ash on the hearth, the two men talked. Tomas explained the flow of heavy air, the principle of the grade, the function of the gravel. Carowway, a man of ditches and culverts, listened intently. He understood drainage. He just never thought to apply it to the air itself. When he left, Carowway was a convert. But he was more than that. He was an agent of change. His professional reputation had been built on being right, on the stability of the roads he managed. Admitting he was wrong about the trench was difficult, but the evidence was irrefutable. And the potential was enormous. That spring, at the township meeting, Carowway didn't just report that the lane near the Wierzycowski claim was undamaged. He stood before the board and proposed a change to the township's road-building specifications. He presented a new design for the drainage ditches that ran alongside the roads in the low-lying valley floor. They were to be deeper, filled with a gravel base, and graded not just to carry spring meltwater, but to channel the winter's cold air away from the roadbed, preventing the deep frost heaves that plagued them every year. The ground freezes because the cold settles on it, he explained to the skeptical board members, but the cold flows. If we give it a channel, it will follow it. He paused, looking at the faces in the room. Wierzycowski taught me. He didn't build a wall against the winter. He dug the winter a new riverbed. The idea was so strange that it might have been dismissed, but it came with Carowway's unimpeachable authority. The motion passed. That summer, the township road crews, using Tomas's principles, reshaped the ditches along the valley roads. The following winter, the roads suffered significantly less damage from frost heaves. The cost of spring repairs dropped by over 60%. The success was undeniable. Word spread from the township to the county seat. Engineers and road commissioners from neighboring counties came to see Carowway's air drains. The simple, elegant principle of the perimeter trench was adapted and copied. By 1885, the Loop County roadwork ordinances officially included specifications for cold air interceptor trenches for all new construction in low-lying areas. The knowledge of a Polish cellar digger, once dismissed as foolishness, had become official policy, quietly saving the county thousands of dollars and untold hours of labor every year. The silent river of cold had finally been given a map. The principle that Tomas applied with a shovel and a plumb line is now a cornerstone of modern sustainable building and landscape architecture. We call it by different names: earth sheltering, passive cooling, geothermal air exchange. But the physics remains the same. Architects today design buildings with underground air intakes that use the stable temperature of the earth to cool air in the summer and preheat it in the winter, reducing reliance on mechanical systems. Farmers in cold valleys plant their most frost-sensitive crops on hillsides, not on the valley floor, knowing that the coldest air will drain away from the slopes. Some even build low stone walls, known as air dams, to divert the flow of cold air away from their orchards on critical spring nights. It is all the same idea, recognizing that the atmosphere is not uniform, that it moves in currents and pools, and that its energy can be managed with intelligent design rather than brute force. What Tomas did in 1879 was more than just a clever trick to stay warm. It was a profound shift in perspective. His neighbors saw the cold as an enemy to be fought, a battle to be won with bigger fires and thicker walls. Theirs was a language of conflict, of resistance. They stood their ground and were besieged. Tomas saw the cold not as an enemy, but as a force of nature with its own logic, as predictable as a river. He did not seek to stop it. He sought only to understand its path. He listened to the quiet language of the land and learned the direction of its invisible currents. He did not build a fortress to withstand the river's force. He simply stepped aside and offered it a more convenient channel. His victory was not one of opposition, but of accommodation. He didn't fight the cold. He gave it somewhere else to go. In that simple act of redirection lies a deep and abiding wisdom, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not found in confronting a force, but in gracefully guiding it along a different path. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found it valuable, please subscribe to our channel and press the like button. It helps us to continue finding and sharing these forgotten histories. And let us know in the comments what you think is the most important lesson from Tomas Wierzchowski's story. We look forward to reading your thoughts. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the technical principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building or agricultural techniques should be done in accordance with modern safety standards, building codes, and professional advice. This presentation does not constitute professional, technical, or legal guidance.